Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of... It's 5, right? No, it's 4. Welcome to episode 4 of Behind a Character, and today we are going to be doing Sparta. Now, Sparta's history is a little strange. He's only been a character of mine for about 3 years. A little less than that, maybe. And his design process has basically been the same, with minor changes here and there. And there's a lot. There were so many design changes for him. Honestly, I have no idea why, but there was. Now, this design is one that kept coming back, though it mostly stayed a little off. He didn't exactly have the same muzzle, and he doesn't have, and he never really had the short tail for that long. Maybe about 2 months, which was about 3 or 4 character designs, I believe. He'd keep switching back between the tail design he has now and this tail design. And during this time, it was more obvious that he was inspired by a German Shepherd than a Fennec Fox, even though he is a hybrid of the both. At this time, he just was more of a German Shepherd, and I think that was because, at the time, I still had my own German Shepherd. Granted, she was a German Shepherd Husky mix, but she was a big inspiration for this character at first. Now, Sparta was made in my freshman year of high school. As you'll notice, a lot of my characters were. And I think I mentioned this in last week's episode, where most of my characters will either be from middle school or freshman year of high school. His design here was pretty straightforward. It was one of my first anthro designs, actually. Him and Glitch were my first 2, as well as a character named Max, who I never really used again, and I might turn him into another character at some point. I'm not entirely sure. And here you can see his signature green eyes were a thing. Now, this design here only lasted a little bit, and I didn't really draw him as an anthro during this phase. And you can see it's basically the same design, just lighter colors slightly, and without the lower bit of his mouth being brown furred, and his paws being inverted. I had the brown where the cream was and the cream where the brown was on his toes. This was really when he and Chipper became close friends in what little of a canon I did have back then to the overarching story. I don't often get to draw non-anthro characters as often as I used to, because I've gotten a lot better at drawing them, but it was a lot of fun to kind of go back to this design, especially with his giant ears. Now, this was an interesting design phase. This is when I actually heavily got into an artist I'm sure most of you know, and if you don't, you should go check her out because she's an amazing animator. Despite all the drama that's happened with her, she's so talented. But I was heavily inspired by Vivzy Pop, and if you can see, I actually am pretty impressed with this, but I was able to mimic her style pretty well. And I wouldn't call this not character theft. We've already discussed that whole situation and my thoughts on that, but design theft. I wouldn't, or art style theft, is that what it's called? Yeah. It was just that I was heavily inspired by her, and I really liked how she drew, and I really liked how she designed characters, and I thought that, hey, maybe if I learned how to draw like she does, I could learn how to design characters. And this style kind of stayed for a while, and I did a lot of art with friends' characters that I made for them, and just in general, I got to learn a lot more about posing, and I got to learn more about style and shading and coloring, and it was just, despite how a lot of people probably view this sort of thing nowadays, back then, which was 3 or 4 years ago, it was a really good learning curve for me, and it really changed how I did art. And I still had my own style, I'd still drawn it, but it vastly improved because of this period. It's also just a lot of fun. I never back then claimed this to be my style. It was just how I liked learning how to draw and throw characters. Now, this was me sort of still coming out of my Vivzy Pop phase. I'll call it my Vivzy Pop phase because that's what it was. And this was just kind of a really tough time that I was going through. It was during my friend... Actually, no. He was never made in freshman year. He was made in my sophomore year, the year I came out as trans. And especially during this point, this was kind of in the middle of the year, so around January or February, when this design was around. And it didn't last long. It originally was created so I could make a fursuit for him. And I only had those 3 colors available to me at the time that actually were decent. And so I changed up his colors to fit what fur I had at home so I could make a suit out of him. That never went anywhere, and the head that I ended up making was god-awful and utterly terrifying. But I was also just going through a really hard time transitioning back then, because I was heavily bullied for it, and interesting things were said to me about it, especially by some people I thought were my friends at the time. So this design really came out during then, and I was kind of going through a self-discovery kind of phase, and this was heavily part of it. And again, this was, this design here, I decided to change Sparta's character design, not just the color palette or whatever, but also his species, and I wanted to go with something that felt a little more at home with me, something a little unique, something that could make me stand out from the crowd. And so I decided to go with a Samoyed, which, if you don't know, it's basically another subspecies of the husky breed. They're like big white fluff balls, and they're adorable, and I love them, and I'd love to own one someday, but that can't happen while I'm in LA because they'd get too hot probably, and I wouldn't want to do that to a dog. But it was interesting trying to translate a Samoyed's body type, because they're big and poofy, into a anthro character, and I ended up not making him an anthro character during this phase. I just kept him as a quadruped, which was a lot of fun, and you can see there was still that element of Vivzy Pop style in there with his feet and legs, which for a while I kept up that paw style. I incorporated it into how I would do my style then. Another thing I wanted to kind of stick out from just Sparta being a pure white dog, because that's what Samoyeds are, I gave him his base colors without the brown. So he kind of looked like a corgi in some ways, as well as a Shiba, and I ended up just turning down the saturation till he was gray and white, so he looked a little less like his original colors. Now here you can see a very similar design to what Sparta is now, and I kept this one for about a year. And it was just basically his normal design. I brought back all the German Shepherd aspects of it with the pattern, and I didn't really bring in any Fennec Fox aspects yet, except for his size. He's around the same size as a regular fox, really. Now, we didn't go through many changes during this time because this was really the design I used made after I moved here. I moved schools, I moved states, I just got away from it all. And this was kind of before shit kind of went down with some past stuff. And everything was just okay for a while. And I didn't really feel the need to change Sparta around for a very long time, because I was just pretty content with how things were going. And I think, as I mentioned in episode 1 with Gold, Gold stopped being my main character for myself, and that ended up being Sparta. And they both are still, my personifications of myself, but Sparta is more of that. So here I was just trying to figure out, which designs were in what order. I should be able to tell by how my art was, but I couldn't. But this design was actually inspired because of the movie Sing. I was obsessed with it. I was obsessed with the style, I was obsessed with the movie, I was obsessed with the world, and I really just wanted Sparta to kind of fit into that when I made this design, so I gave him all sorts of clothes and stuff. This was really where I got the hang of drawing paws in a more hand-like form. It was also where I could really experiment with pastels, because if you don't know anything about me, I love pastels. I love incorporating pastels into everything. This is also where I more incorporated his fennec fox side of his genes. I say genes, but I'll get into that little tidbit later. This design lasted a week. I don't really know what I was going for it with this, but I think it was supposed to tie in more with Chipper's lore, where how he discovered gems in a cave and got his colors, because he's a Dutch angel dragon, if you didn't know, or if you did, kudos to you, because sometimes they're hard to design, and not just outright look like a dragon. But I think it was supposed to tie more into that, because that's how he and Sparta met, and Sparta kind of adopted him. But it was also just kind of an experiment to see what I could do with watercolor type of paintings and stuff, with regular line art. I also changed his eye colors a lot with that. Now, this design for Sparta was really where his lore started to fit in more with his character, besides him being a Fennec Fox and German Shepherd hybrid. I really wanted to make him look more like a German Shepherd hybrid with a Fennec Fox, so I tried to make his face shape and look more like it, his body shape look more like a German Shepherd's mixed with Fennec Fox's body type. And I did a lot of animal studies and stuff for that, which was a lot of fun in hindsight. I did it all in one of my sketchbooks. But as you can see in the reference sheet, he has a robot form, and that's because, well, he's an android, kinda. He's like, how do I explain this? He's like a full-on robot, and he's able to do a lot of more regular animal things, like eating and stuff, mostly because he has synthetic organs and things like that. His fur is actually made out of nanobites, or nanotech, or whatever they're called. And he was one of the first successful experiments of Will, actually. He's like Will's kid. And now we come to current Sparta. Current Sparta is obviously Asian, specifically Korean. He's based off of different K-pop stars, and that's kind of where his new backstory has led him to. That's not a word. This is what happens when you don't have a script. I based him off of Woo Young from ATEEZ, who is honestly one of my favorite K-pop bands, besides Tomorrow X Together, who I actually inspired his own K-pop group. If you don't know, in the lore of Psychosis, he owns, or well, no, he doesn't own, but he started a K-pop group, and he was actually the first musician that was more like what kind of music we have today. Most of the music in the world was like classical or spiritual in some way, and he really branched out and started the whole pop band rock thing. He does like a mix of K-pop and rock, and there aren't technically countries in this world. I mean, there are, but they're not structured like they are in our world. So he basically created, to us, Korean, to him, just some language. He doesn't even really know what it's called. It just kind of was something that he made up. But that's where Star comes from, and all those characters. And I'm hopefully in the future going to actually create actual music, actual songs, actual music videos and stuff for this fictional band that I've made, which I hope will tie more into the lore of the story eventually. But I based his face shape off of Woo Young's, and kind of his personality too. While his personality is mostly based off of myself, it's also where his voice idea came from. But I hope you liked today's episode, and I hope you'll join me for next week. Thank you so much for watching.